And both these women have been making waves on both sides of the Atlantic with their outspoken, passionate activism. So I'm very excited to hear them both speak to each other in this next session. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Naz.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to be back on a virtual Concordia retreat and forum. But it's a huge honor for me to be introducing and talking to Representative Ilhan Omar this afternoon. Ilhan doesn't need any introduction. She's really amassed a huge following, not only in the States, but across the globe. Somebody who's really true to herself and is inspiring people like me over here in the UK, and you know, speaking truth to power, really. So without further ado, I'm going to bring in Ilhan. Assalamu alaikum, Ilhan.
Wa alaikum salam, Naz. Thank you so much for that introduction. It's really great to be here with you all.
Oh, well, so we'll get stuck straight in because we've got limited time with you, and it's an absolute pleasure to have you here. But tell us, what are you involved in at the moment over in the States with how is COVID panning out for you guys?
Yeah, thank you for asking. I hope everyone is staying safe. I know people are talking about social distancing, but we're actually only physically distancing because we're socially connecting in so many aspects of our lives with our loved ones and colleagues, not just in the same country, but apparently we are connecting with colleagues across the Atlantic. So it's really such an honor to join you all here. As you know, we're dealing with a global pandemic, but we're also dealing with a financial crisis that comes out of and is born out of that, that crisis. And so our work here has been in trying to provide proper information to our constituents and trying to make sure that their lives and livelihoods are protected as we move legislation that is going to provide necessary relief to them in a timely manner. We've been able to pass in Congress and advocate for 3 relief packages. One, to work on getting the resources that are needed to expedite the testing that our country needed to do in order to fully understand how many of our constituents, how many people in this country are at risk, and to actually put a plan together so that we can really deal with this pandemic in a cohesive way. And then we've worked on packages to deliver economic relief to people. And so the 3rd package that passed, I actually was really quite involved in trying to make sure it was a cohesive package. What we ended up with wasn't something that I was very proud of, but ultimately supported it because I believed in this time that it is necessary that we do everything that we can, again, to protect the lives and the livelihoods of the people that we represent. So we were able to get an expanded relief for unemployment insurance and get money into the hands of people, get $1,200 stimulus check to folks, get relief to our small businesses, get some resources to our municipalities and states. And right now we're working on a relief package that is hopefully going to get processed in the next couple of weeks. And my priority in that has been trying to make sure that we're tackling the economic challenges that this pandemic produces for many of us. As you know, debt continues to pile up for people. April 1st came, many of our constituents weren't able to pay their rent. Many people are not able to pay their mortgages. Many people don't have the resources that they need to feed themselves or keep the electricity going and get water running in their homes. And so we're fighting really hard to get a legislation passed to cancel rent and mortgages and create a pool of funding so that landlords and lenders are able to get the resources from there. And people's primary residence is covered in that, and they're not accumulating further debt as this pandemic continues. We've also introduced legislation to help get similar resources to small businesses so that they're able to keep their overhead costs, pay for things like maintenance and their rent, and make sure that they're able to keep some of their employees paid as well. But what we are realizing is that this pandemic is laying bare many of the economic and social and environmental injustices that have existed and persisted in our country for so long. And so my advocacy and organizing has been in shedding light on that and trying to make sure many of the policy agenda that we had prior to this pandemic now get implemented as we move through this pandemic and think about what happens next. So many Americans have their health insurance tied to their employment, and we now have about 20 million Americans who are unemployed. So many of them, about 12 million of them, have lost their employment, they've lost their health insurance through their employment. And so the policies that we advocated for, like Medicare for All, are very timely at the moment, and we're hoping that we can get some movement in that as well. I had a big legislation that I introduced last year, which was called Homes for All, which guaranteed housing for everyone. And with the crisis that we are in at the moment, and the devastation that is about to happen to our housing market, there's many conversations happening about the need for a bill like that. And so we're hoping that we can move that conversation further along. And so, as someone who survived many challenges in life, I realize that there's always an opportunity that's born out of every challenge. And so we're utilizing this challenge to really create an opportunity to have critical conversations, to advocate on behalf of our constituents, and make sure that any package that we have is cohesive and is comprehensive and allows for there to be relief for people and for their lives to be enhanced by it.
So tell me, how are you on a practical level? So here in Parliament, we're looking at introducing a virtual Parliament. How are you working to get this legislation through? Because we're really, in our history, Britain is known as the mother of all Parliament, and having to do this virtual Prime Minister's questions this Wednesday is proving quite a challenge to us. So how are you guys doing it over there?
Yeah, so we have not really figured out how to virtually vote yet, and I know that our speaker is opposed to that, so we might not be able to do that. And we're hoping that any piece of legislation that we introduce in the package that we put together, it's not going to go through the process that the last one went through, where we were all called in to vote in person, which I think endangers our lives and endangers the lives of many of our staff who need to be there to ensure that the process goes smoothly. And so what we're hoping for is that this next package is voice voted, and we don't have to really be there to have quorum, and it could pass without actually having any of us present. But 99% of the conversation that we're having right now is virtually happening. So we have our weekly caucus calls twice a week. We come together and have the conversation about the policies that we want to see implemented, what we're hearing from our constituents, what does it look like on the ground, and how do we cohesively move a piece of legislation with Republicans on the other side of the aisle, truly opposed to doing anything that is productive for many of our constituents. But I also serve as the whip for the Progressive Caucus for Congress, and I serve as the whip for the region in our caucus, for my region, the Midwest. And so I get to be part of some of the leadership conversations, and we are moving the process along that way. It's amazing what you can do with technology. And so as much as we are all physically distant, we continue to do the work and still introduce pieces of legislation in the hopes that when we put our big omnibus bill together, many of the pieces of legislation that we have will be implemented in that.
So on a personal level, as the first Muslim woman in one of the first Muslim women in Congress, you know, you're subject to lots and lots of targeting. I think it's really useful, especially as a fellow Muslim woman in the public eye. You raise your head above a parapet and the trolls come out. How do you deal with it? How do you cope with it? What are your mechanisms that you use that you'd like to share with fellow Concordians?
You know, I'm centered in the fact that I know who I am and what my purpose on this earth really is about. And so I really don't pay that much attention to the attacks. I know you know, some wise person once said, racism has one ultimate function, and that is to distract you and render you useless. And so for me, it's been useful to use that advice and not to allow any of the attacks and the scrutiny to deter me from the work that I need to do on behalf of my constituents and my constituency at large. It's important that we continue to show up every single day, do the work that we can. And as Muslims, we know, you know, the best dua, the best da'wah that we can give is to show up as good Muslims, as bold Muslims, as truthful Muslims. And that's how the world gets to learn about our faith, gets to learn about what are the values that are enshrined in us because of our faith. And that's how I show up every single day and lead.
And you talk a lot about women's solidarity, don't you? So talk to us a bit about that. Where do you know, how important is it? Because I know there's only a few of us in Parliament as well, in total Muslims, and there's a few of us Muslim women, and I actually find lots and lots of comfort from Muslims from other parties as well. So we on Muslim issues are very, very much together and fight in the corner. So how important is that female solidarity to you?
Yeah, I mean, solidarity, I think, around many of the common challenges that we have is really important. I remember reading a really important quote from a woman that I admire and would have been really honored to have had the opportunity to serve with her. She was one of the first African Americans to serve in Congress and the first African American woman. Her name is Shirley Chisholm. She's no longer with us. But she said of all of the marginalized identity that she had, one of the most challenging one was the fact that she was born a female. And so we know in many of the spaces that we exist, regardless of our Muslimness, regardless of, you know, our race, gender oftentimes is a bigger obstacle to leadership than anything else. And so there is a solidarity with the members of Congress. We have a huge number for the first time of female members of Congress on both sides of the aisle. But I also connect with, you know, female leaders in Brazil and in Ireland, in Britain, in Australia. And it's really helpful, you know, in Africa, in the Middle East, even some members who serve on in the parliament in Israel. And I think the one thing that connects us is our fierceness, right? Our ability to really hone in on the fact that we are there. This is an opportunity that we have that many don't get to have. To really influence public policy and create a positive change on the lives of the people that we serve. And I think, you know, women oftentimes are very much the caretakers, the caregivers, and we tend to be more successful as legislators because we oftentimes introduce legislation that really gets to the heart of the issues that exist in our communities and are able to build consensus. You know, no shade to any of the men who are with us, but, you know, women are often consensus builders, and we do relationships really well, and I think that leads to us having a successful time. And I think that's why so often people fight so hard to make sure we don't get a seat at the table.
Absolutely, I couldn't concur more. So talk to us about the upcoming 2020 election. So our local elections have been cancelled with COVID, and we've scheduled them for next year. That includes the mayoral London election, where Sadiq Khan is our mayor. So what's happening across the pond with the 2020, and what are you doing? What's your role, and what are you going to be doing?
So I come from one of the states that has the most liberal and most democratic voting processes. That is, I think, why Minnesota oftentimes has higher voting rates. And one of the things that we found to be useful is our ability to absentee vote. And that be without, any excuse. It doesn't really matter if you're ill or not. If your job allows you to come out and vote or not, if you're in the state or not, you can just request your absentee ballot and vote. And so we're trying to fight really hard to try to make sure that that's nationalized, and that we have the resources to the states to be able to implement a nationwide absentee voting and mail-in voting, because we know that this pandemic might not really end, or many of our communities might not have a full handle on it by the time October, September, and November come around. And for me, I have a primary election that is in August, and so it's important that there are opportunities being created for people to vote without risking their lives. The Republicans have been extremely opposed to this idea. They say there is voter fraud, but the president himself absentee votes. And so, we're trying to make the case to say, if you as the president are able to do this, why can't a regular citizen be able to do just that? And I think ultimately we will win that conversation. My senator who ran for president, Amy Klobuchar, and Senator Elizabeth Warren, Senator Harris, are all advocating to put the resources in the next relief package that we pass. And I think we will be successful in trying to get the money that the states need in order to implement a mail-in voting process.
So whilst we're on 2020, you endorsed you endorsed Bernie Sanders. So what is what are you going to be supporting Joe Biden? What are your views on Joe Biden's candidacy?
It's a good question. I endorsed Bernie Sanders and really was inspired by him, not because of who he is, but for the policies that he advocates for. And my district out of all of Minnesota was the only district to vote for the senator. And so my constituents really are very much policy focused. Their main priority isn't whether you're a Democrat or not. It's about what policy are you putting forth, and are the policies that you're creating going to create a positive change in my life? And so they tend to be very progressive. They tend to be very people-centered, policy-driven. And so issues like Medicare for all, issues like housing for all, issues like the Green New Deal, issues around, comprehensive immigration policy, issues around, getting rid of the Muslim ban, trying to have a more inclusive society, expanding our democracy and allowing more people to participate in it. All of those issues are really at the center of what drives people in my district to come out. And so in the conversations that we are having right now, post to Senator Sanders' endorsement of Joe Biden, have been around how many of those policies that the people that I represent care about can be implemented or have a fighting chance with Joe Biden. And so we are in the midst of really helping them develop and pushing them to develop a more comprehensive policy that really restores hope for people and gives them the urgency to want to come out. Joe Biden right now lacks enthusiasm. He has, I think, one of the lowest enthusiasm rates for anyone who is at this level and on a presidential race. And the only way you bring that up is by, having a policy platform that speaks to people. And as a millennial, I represent a generation that really feels like we want somebody to speak our language, and our language is policy. And we want people who understand how important these policy proposals are to us, and folks who will give us a plan on how to implement them.
Okay, so you talked about the Muslim ban there. So would love to hear, Zahid has asked the question, would love to hear your response to the President Trump's attempt to blame you and AOC for his retweeting of an Islamophobic message asking if mosques will be closed to Ramadan. So you've got Trump and we've got Katie Hopkins and Tommy Robinson. So, what are your responses to that?
Yeah, he had, with the pandemic, he no longer gets to have his xenophobic, hateful rallies. And now he's turning, the press briefings in the White House to those similar hateful rallies that he's known for. So it was quite interesting yesterday as some, people were talking to him about this hateful tweet that he retweeted that basically was saying, like, who's going to watch the Muslims? They're going to come out in doing Ramadan, when we know not a single imam or a masjid has advocated in having the people not abide by the stay-at-home policies that many of our states have. And so, those kind of distraction is something that he's known for, because now the conversation really is about, what did he say about Ilhan and Alex? And no one is talking about how he's a, hateful, divisive, anti-Muslim president, how we're going to do everything to get rid of him soon.
So thank you for that. We seem to have quite a bit in common. I remember being at an event when the day we had Brexit, and we were thinking whether the Americans would vote Trump. So you kind of like took it from us, and then we voted Boris Johnson. So we have some synergies, I suppose.
Yes. How is Boris doing?
Well, to be fair, I wish him well, and I hope he's recovered, because he needs to be back at the helm, really. And it's an interesting time having to work together, because we've got a national crisis while at the same time holding the government to account. So it's been really, really interesting on the kind of this whole idea of herd immunity, whether the government was too late in putting lockdown in, and how many days we've missed, and how many more lives could have been saved. And we still don't know the real death rate from our care homes. So there's lots of conversations going on. One of them is, before I come on to the next question, one of them is about the lack of protective equipment for our healthcare, for our nurses. Is that something that you guys are dealing with? Because we're seeing it as a national crisis right now.
Yeah, I mean, that really has been the most disturbing part of this whole pandemic. We have people who we are sending in every single day to save lives, and they don't have the equipment that they need. And I recently held, we've had like 5 virtual town halls on Facebook with health experts from the University of Minnesota, with nurses and frontline workers in my district. But I've also done some with Alexandria, Rashida, Ayanna Presley, and myself, have been on some of these virtual, we hosted a virtual Facebook town hall to talk to nurses and frontline workers. And you know, we're hearing from them that we're asking them and sending them to a battlefield without giving them proper weapons. And so, you know, we are one of the wealthiest countries in the world. And to not have adequate supply of protective gear for our frontline workers is unexcusable, it's unconscionable. And so we've been fighting really hard every single day. I mean, this is like a top priority conversation in trying to urge this government, this administration, and members of Congress to continue to push for the production of these supplies so that they have them. But I think beyond that, you know, we're working on legislation with some of the leaders, myself, Pamela Chayapal, Rolkana, and Mark Pocan are pushing for things like hazard pay for frontline workers. We're trying to assure that they have resources for childcare, that there is paid sick leave for them. I've sent money, I've sent letters to the agency that does the employment protection. I sit on Education and Labor, on the Education and Labor Committee. And so workforce protection is one of the subcommittees I serve on. And so we're working really hard to try to make sure that the frontline workers who are talking about how they are unsafe in their workplaces are not retaliated against. You know, there are cases in Minnesota, there are cases around the country where people are getting fired or being reprimanded because they spoke about how unsafe it is for them to work because there is no protection for them, or how unsafe it is for them to come to work because they're sick. And so that has been a priority for us. And I know earlier someone said, you know, what are the top concerns of some of your constituents this time? You know, dealing with the economy is a huge issue, which is why we're working on the policies to cancel out rent and mortgage, and trying to have, you know, the direct cash payments that are universal and monthly. But it's, you know, we're also trying to make sure that small businesses are saved and have the resources that they need. And one issue that oftentimes people don't talk about that is a huge issue for many of my constituents, that there's about 140,000 Minnesotans who live in a mixed family status, in a mixed status families, where one member of the family is fully documented, has a social security card, and the other member doesn't. So the last package that we passed for members who are in the military, we allowed for them to receive the relief fund of the $1,200 if they are in a mixed status family. So if a military member is married to someone who is undocumented but legally in the country, they can receive that. But we didn't do that for every other American. And so there are husbands who have wives who have no Social Security, and so they're not able to get the $1,200. They're not able to get the money for their children, and that's causing a lot of issues, because that's a big number. 140,000 is a huge number in our state, and so we're trying to fill some of the little gaps that were created by the package that we have, because when we talk to our constituents, they are having anxiety about their lives and how they're going to sustain themselves.
I think that's similar to the constituents. My constituents have had huge issues with you know, businesses closing, losing their jobs, not being able to furlough, not getting the support that the government is putting in place, universal credit. It really, really is. We've had over 1 million applications within the first few weeks of lockdown, just for universal credit, the new kind of system that we're trying to go on. And one of the things that we've had here is we've had a higher representation of deaf amongst the Black and minority ethnic communities. So the question from Mohammed Amin is, how much attention is the high deaf rate in African American communities getting? So we've seen it on the liberal media, such as New York Times, Washington Post. Is it being talked about on Fox News, and what's the kind of spin they're putting on it, really?
Oh, it's being talked about, but not in the ways you and I would appreciate. It's actually really disheartening, the spin that they have. I mean, we have some cities where, you know, the people who are dying from COVID-19, 70% of those deaths are African American or people of color. And so the Congressional Black Caucus, which I'm a member of, has been holding regular conversations with Black mayors around the country. We have had many conversations with healthcare experts, having conversations with influencers around the country in trying to really understand what are some things that we can do right now to mitigate some of the deaths, and then what are some things that we can do tomorrow to make sure that our communities are protected into the future. And so one of the things that we can do now is to expand the level of testing that is happening in these communities and make that testing accessible, because that hasn't happened. Really talk about who is vulnerable in these communities, and the fact that no one is really immune to contracting the virus. You know, my cousin passed away in England, in London, because of the COVID-19, and I know it sparked a whole conversation in the Somali community and in many of my cousins and uncles and aunties who live there, in their circles, because, you know, he was young, very healthy person, and no one really expected for him to first get it and for him to die from it so suddenly. And I think, you know, with the conversations that we're having with these mayors, with the conversations we're having with some of the influencers, we're recognizing that it is important for us to ask for and collect data, because that is the only way that you can create an informed public policy. But also, you know, moving into the future, we need to make sure that resources are concentrated into these communities, that there is a policy agenda that will uplift them from the situations that make them susceptible to dangers like this. There is a social determinants of health. Housing is part of that. You know, where you live, your environment has a lot to do with that. Your income has a lot to do with that. And many of African American communities, many Black communities, many Latino communities here in the United States have high rates of asthma, have high rates of many illnesses like diabetes and cancer and such. And for so long, you know, we haven't really had a proper conversation on how to center and centralize resources into these communities, and now we get to do that. And that's one of the opportunities that this challenge is presenting for those of us who are members of the Congressional Black Caucus. And I know the Hispanic Caucus is also having that conversation as well.
Yeah, we're having conversations about the prevalence of COVID and the death rates, and the first doctors to die on the front line were all Muslim doctors, Black minority ethnic heritage. So we are having them conversations here as well. And I think one of the things that is very apparent is the glaring inequalities that you're talking about are consistent with places like in my constituency in Bradford West. You know, there's years and years of austerity, and it really just opens up the kind of the inequalities for people, really. We've got another. I wanted to ask you, moving away from COVID in particular, but more about you. Who are your political heroes and who are your political mentors?
I don't really like the word heroes.
Heroines then, or whoever, however you want to define it.
I mean, there are a lot of people I find inspiring. You know, Senator Bernie Sanders is an inspiration for me, because, you know, I try to have a political life that is with integrity, and one that is really centered on and focused on the people that I serve. There's a lot of conversations that people have about being bought and bossed, and I think the senator really gives us something to inspire for, when you see how he's held his beliefs for decades, and had really stayed fast to his beliefs. I'm certainly inspired by the speaker. There are a lot of women around the world that give me an inspiration. I think to find yourself in political leadership twice in a country like ours is certainly inspiring, and the woman doesn't also get tired. You know, I'm in my like late 30s and I can't be in heels all day. And I oftentimes cannot stand for like 10 hours a day. And as someone who's traveled with the speaker in her 70s, I mean, I wish I could have half of the energy that she has, and the mental capacity she has to absorb information and continue to have empathy for the people that she is having a conversation with, regardless of what their political views are. And, you know, there are people like Karen Bass, who chairs the Africa Subcommittee on Foreign Affairs, who, you know, her love for Africa is such a refreshing, as the only African to ever serve in Congress. It's really good to have her lead and not make me feel like I wanna cry or scream every single day as we talk about Africa as a country, even though it's a whole continent with people who have aspirations and hopes and dreams, just like the rest of the world does. Yeah, so I mean, you know, the list can, I mean, it's a long list, but there are some really amazing people I get to serve with. I serve with John Lewis, you know, a civil rights icon. Yeah, I mean, they're really great people who I love, that I get to be around. You know, I'm certainly inspired by my sisters in the squad. Ayanna Presley is the most underrated member of the squad. She's just really a powerhouse, and an inspiration. The life that woman had lived, and the way she continues to show up every single day is just miraculous. I think all of us get celebrated in ways that she doesn't. And it's just inspiring to watch her do her work. I am on a task force with her to deal with maternal mortality rates in the Black community, and is, you know, we've worked on dealing with some of the push out policies that exist within our schools as we discipline young women of color. Something I certainly experienced in my younger years in school districts around this country. And she certainly has as well. And so we get to lead and introduce legislation together that oftentimes doesn't get talked about, but really has positive impact on the people that we serve. And a lot of the young people who see us as an inspiration, we get to do work on their behalf and do work with them every single day. That doesn't really make it to the headlines, and people don't get to read about, but there's a lot of those kind of legislation that we do that are central to many of the marginalized communities that we identify with as well.
So one of the things is about, you know, people not getting recognised. One of the things in World War One, World War Two, the Muslim contribution wasn't recognised, and now we're playing catch up to say, look, this is what our forefathers did in the contribution in World War Two. But in terms of us capturing our narratives, I think, you know, history belongs to the holder of a pen or the one who tells it. And now we have social media and lots of ways to capture it all. But how can Concordians, and this is a particular question from the chair of the Advisory Council, Concordia Advisory Council, what can Concordians do to support you in your fight against COVID, and equally make sure that we're highlighting the contribution of Muslims in this war against COVID?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'll answer this, and then I have to go. I know we're like 12 minutes beyond the time I was supposed to be off, and so like, everybody's knocking at the door here. So, you know, oftentimes we do work that doesn't really reach the people that we are doing the work on behalf of. And so what Concordia can do is make sure that like our work reaches reaches the constituencies that we want our work to reach. I know that he was also asking about like many of the Muslims who are working around the country, many of them who are frontline workers. I know in England, many of the first healthcare workers who died were Muslim doctors. And so, you know, trying to make sure that there is a hub where all of that information is collected and celebrated. You know, I serve on foreign affairs. We're doing a lot of work and are in conversations with the State Department every single day, talking to embassies. You know, I have conversations with ambassadors around the world on daily basis, talking to them about the work that they're doing in their countries, on some of the countries that, you know, in the world, around the world, who, if this hits them as much as it's hit us in England and here in the United States, you know, it'd be complete genocide, like it'd be extremely devastating. So I'm talking to them about what they need, what's getting done, how do we build consensus. I know here as a member of Congress, you know, my constituents expect me to fight for them today. So there isn't a lot of room. I'm sure you get this, even though you care about what's happening around the world, there isn't a lot of appetite about the work that you do or want to talk about on what's happening around the world. And so I think Concordia can create that hub to try to really centralize resources and information on some of the work that we are doing around the world, and really kind of making us feel a lot closer than we are feeling right now. You know, I would love to hear about, you know, efforts that are being deployed in different parts of the world where members of Concordia are, and how we can support them, whether it is on an individual level, whether it is on our, you know, on a political level, and whether it is on a professional level.
I'm going to ask you one more question before you go, simple as a Muslim politician to another. What top tips would you give to people of colour who are considering coming into politics in this environment, in today's environment, you know, with the rise of Trump and Boris over here and the rise of the far right internationally? What are your top tips? Your parting word for us all.
Well, one, believe in yourself. Believe in your ability to lead. I think oftentimes, you know, people internalize the message, the external messages that they get, that we are less than, this is not our place, we shouldn't lead, we should minimize our Muslimness, you know, our ethnic backgrounds, all of that, and try to find a way to get rid of those, because everything that you are made of really is the whole sum of you, and your constituency oftentimes wants all of you. And so when you're leaving pieces of you, you are not an authentic person, and you can't really be as bold and brave as you should be. So lean into everything that has made you who you are. And I will say, you know, like, we often are our harshest critics. You know, like the Muslim community, or whatever, you know, ethnic background we might have, or whatever country we originally might come from, that group is often the most critical of us. And to think of them as family, you know, family is supposed to be critical of you. Family shapes you into the strong person that you are. And not to look at that as a deterrent to continue and push forward. I often use the criticism that I get from the Muslim community, the Somali community, as an inspiration. I use that as a fuel to keep going and to keep doing better. Because I look at that as like my own family. You know, when my dad says something critical, or my brother says something critical, my sister says something critical, I don't run and hide. I think, like, how can I work to make them proud? And so we should utilize that. You know, Rashida and I were talking about this the other day. You know, the astaghfirullahs we get should, like, you fuel us to turn those into masha'Allahs. And I think that's really what the inspiration is. So I want to make sure everybody, you know, first works on the internal part, because if you're not strong here, you can be strong out here. And so make sure that you make a list for yourself of things that you can take and you can't take. And then work in developing a thick skin for that. You know, when I first ran for the Minnesota House, I had a big list of horrible things that could happen to me. And almost none of it really happened. And so I was, every single day, I looked back at the list when something would come up, and I was like, this is not as bad as what I thought it was, so I'm good. And I did the same thing when I ran for Congress. So I was, every day, you know, I wake up and I think, like, I check my mental notes of horrible things, and I'm like, that hasn't happened yet. I'm good to go. And I think because we represent a constituency that have been beat down, misrepresented, and felt really beaten into submission and shame, we have to really own our identity and take that back and recognize that everything people say about us or everything people do to us is not as bad as it would be if we just took it laying down. So we got to push forward. You know, people in the United States who fought for civil rights were getting hosed down and having dogs chase them. None of those things are happening to Muslims. And so we have to remember that what we're fighting for is equal representation, equal voice, equal presence on a political platform. Yeah, so people are going to come after us because we're loud, we're proud. But that doesn't mean that we get less loud and less proud. It just means we grow into that and continue to inspire more. Because once we have, you know, tens of Ilhans and Rashidas and Andre Carsons and Keith Ellisons and, you know, Naz Shah's, like, it doesn't matter anymore. No one will be like that Muslim representative. It'll just be like Ilhan. Remember Ilhan, who was in Congress? Or, you know, like, that would be the conversation. People talk about us as the Muslim now because there's a handful of us. And so if we survive and we push forward and there isn't a handful of us, people will stop talking about that Muslim, because people do that now with Latino members. People do that now with, you know, Jewish members of Congress. No one really points to them and says, you know, the Latino member or the Jewish member, or the African-American member, they did that at some point. They don't do that anymore because there's enough of them. And once there are more of us, no one would really, like, utilize our identity as a weapon against us. They do that now because we stand out because of our identity. And so I guess that's, like, my parting words, like, to never really allow yourself to feel deterred by the conversations others are having about you. Only worry about the conversations you get to have about yourself internally, and push forward.
Oh, alhamdulillah, those are beautiful, beautiful words. That certainly inspired me, because we all need our inspiration, because it's tough at the top and it gets lonely at the top, and the challenges are very, very far and wide. I think I'm going to do what Mudassir did earlier before you leave, is ask everybody to get off their mute buttons, and we have over 100 people. That was the maximum allowed.
Connecting into to make America great again coffee, isn't it?
Thank you.
And I think it kind of represents the entire politics. I wonder
Thank you
what
so
that
much, Ilhan from
conversation
London.
Lovely, lovely.
Montreal.
Thank you.
It's just they refer to
You,
it.
Ilhan, you're doing an amazing job, mashallah. I increase your life.
Thank you
From
so
South
much.
Africa.
Naz, thank you so much. You did a great job.
Bless you all.
Bye, Naz. Thank you so much for doing this with me.
Thank you so much.
It makes me feel icky to me. I don't know how everyone else feels about it.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for participating in this. Thank you, Ilhan, Naz. We're waiting for Mudassir to join us again.
Yeah, I'm here.
There you are.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Yeah, I think when we unmuted ourselves, it kind of unleashed like chaos, creative chaos. It's all well and good. Well, thank you, everyone. We're back here now. That was a very enlightening, useful, and helpful discussion. Thank you so much, Naz, for ably hosting that. Now we're going to move on to our next session. I believe the host for our next session, Wajahat, is already here, but our next session is with Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, the legendary American Muslim scholar. Sheikh Hamza, are you online?